there have been a few very powerful presentations that I've been able to sit and listen to. The last one, obviously, was by Fatima Bhutto. I do, obviously, you know, we live in a moment of history where the idea of torture has regained some footing in the most powerful, you know, corridors of power, namely the White House. I understand what Fatima was just saying about the narratives and how it plays on our sympathies and how film often is not innocent and who are the storytellers and who are the filmmakers. But I do not believe that that necessarily means that we, the gullible people, necessarily believe that. I don't think, if you take a poll in the United States today, for instance, that the majority of the people support torture. In fact, I think the opposite. And I think it's very important that under the Obama administration, the torture that was conducted under the Bush administration was made illegal, and that even under pressure, certainly when Theresa May was standing beside him, Donald Trump, who did bring up the normalization of waterboarding and torture again and suggested maybe he'd bring it back, was forced to say that actually he would concede that leadership to his defense secretary, General Jim Mattis, who strongly does not believe torture works and who said to him at one point, you know, give me a can of beer and a pack of cigarettes and I can get more out of whoever I'm interrogating than slapping them around or waterboarding them or worse. And I do think it's really important to say that in the United States, the single person who was most responsible for convincing the authorities and the public that torture didn't work was a man called Ali Soufan, a Muslim American who worked for the FBI and who was part of the interrogation of Abu Zubaydah, and who stated categorically that they did not get their evidence from the harsh tactics. So I think that part of a very scary narrative about who is telling us our stories and what propaganda they're telling us, which obviously is the reality that we live in. I think the human, individual, intellectual, intelligent, information-ridden capacity of us to decide what we believe is what gives us some hope.
I'm surprised that you're so optimistic, particularly in the light of what's happened both in this country and, of course, now in America with Trump being voted in. I mean, do you really believe that the people are more enlightened than the information that they're given?
I'm not that optimistic.
A lot of people, just going to the topic of news, you know, we talk about fake narrative in movies. Are we naive to expect our news to not come with a narrative? I mean, Trump had just branded CNN as fake news and refused to...
And now his you know, chief advisor, Kellyanne Conway, under relentless interrogation by one of our anchors, Jake Tapper, over the last couple of days, was forced to say on national and international television that no, CNN is not fake news. So yeah, thanks, Kellyanne. You know, we are obviously living in extraordinary times, and for those of us who are the storytellers, who do go to the front lines, who are your eyes and ears, who are willing to get up and bear witness to some of the things that you cannot, but you need to know the information, it is a very difficult time for us because of who's president of the United States, and not only that, of what the Russians are doing to compromise, you know, the idea of objective news, and we've seen that over and over again. It's not just happening in the United States, it's happening in France, it's happening in Germany, it's happening across Europe. The whole idea of objective news is being compromised. But I strongly believe that what has happened over the last several months with this relentless assault on many things, but in our domain, the assault on truthful and objective information, is a massive pushback. Again, that is what gives me hope. Not the fact that we are under assault, but the pushback that's going on. We are not going to take this lying down. Women are not going to take it lying down. Journalists are not going to take it down. People who believe in human rights are not going to take it down, are not going to take it lying down. And I think this is actually an extremely important moment for us to realize that as citizens, we have a duty to get out and do and fight our corner, whether we're journalists, to fight our corner for the truth, and to not allow people to troll us or tweet us or social media us or president us or bannon us or whatever it might be. We are not going to take that lying down, and we are fighting back, and it is making a difference right now. It was very, very tough for the first few weeks. But it's making a difference right now. The fact that women's rights may or may not be under assault depending on what legislation is enacted in the coming years and what judgments are made in the Supreme Court and elsewhere, and what funding is removed from, you know, women's health care and other such things. Women are out in the streets. 53% of white women, though, voted for Donald Trump in the United States. And that's the reality. And now they're realizing, and a lot of people are realizing, even people who voted for him, this is not about politics. This is about truth. It's about rights. It's about our humanity. And I think people will give him a chance where they think he might deliver what he promised in his election on the economy and such like. And then when they see things that they don't like, hopefully they will continue to stand up for the common values that we share, the human rights that we believe in, the civil rights that have been granted certainly in the United States under a constitution. And that is what gives me some hope right now.
I'm sure, like you, I'm kind of reluctant to give Trump much more airtime than he's already getting in a way. So I wondered if we could talk a bit about the imagery of conflict, or as Fatima said so succinctly, warnography, and about that sense as viewers of the sort of barrage of imagery that we're privy to now, and the fact that we can go online. And as Sophie, our first speaker this morning, talked about, the fact that you can zoom in now on everything from a refugee camp to a battle. Do you think that there is a sense that as viewers we become jaded, that it loses its impact, and that a single still shot of a dead child on a Greek beach in a way speaks louder to us than all the noise?
Well, it does, but only for 15 minutes. Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame is now, 15 seconds of attention. Our technology has been incredibly useful in spreading information and connecting us all, and as Hassan said, able to show him in real time how to get from, the war zone in Syria all the way to England. I mean, all the refugees have got their smartphones and they get the directions and this and that. But the pernicious effect of it is that it has allowed us to feel comforted by feeling a moment of outrage and then not staying with the program. Aylan Kurdi or the poor child who was sitting on the, who was bombed in Syria with the shrapnel stuff all over his face, or whoever else it is. I've covered many of the stories that Hassan was talking about, people who had to come out of Syria being carried by their parents on wheelchairs, to get across mountains and this and that and into boats. I think that going back to what Biban said about the power of film, image, and storytelling as a shared experience is under threat. I think the sharing is so like this that everybody can take comfort in click-tivism and that kind of activism and that kind of empathy and that kind of sympathy, and it lasts 2 seconds. When I was covering Bosnia, and I spent the whole of the 90s covering Bosnia and Somalia and Rwanda and Haiti and all these other places, I know for a fact that what we did in Bosnia changed the dynamic, because we were there week after week for the whole 4 years of the war, day, week, month, year, and we were there and we sacrificed our lives and we sacrificed our, everything to do what we did because we believed in telling that story. And in the end, late as it was, and hundreds of thousands of people later who had been killed, by ethnic cleansing / genocide, by the way it turned out, which we were telling and nobody wanted to believe because they all wanted to believe that all sides were equally guilty. In the end, one massacre too far was Srebrenica. And President Clinton gathered a coalition and eventually they did the right thing. And the war was stopped and there was a negotiation and there was a peace process. And to this day, that peace lasts. It's not perfect. It's fraying around the edges, but it lasts. And not only that, not a single Allied soldier had to put their foot on the ground. There were no boots on the ground, and not one was ever killed in anger. So this notion that you can't do something in Syria, which I'm sure all of you believe, that we can't do anything in Syria because of what happened in Iraq and what happened here and what happened there. The pendulum of this pernicious overreaction by the Bush administration in Iraq has swung all the way over to here, where pernicious inaction has caused 500,000 people to be killed in Syria, of which I'm sure Hassan's family and friends are among them, 12 million refugees, which has had the ongoing effect of the, of the backlash in politics here in Europe and all the rest of it.
So do you think that this,
and I believe that could have been stopped without a single boot on the ground, with a few planes in the air, maybe a cruise missile into Assad's, not his people, but onto his airfield, so to stop him putting the barrel bombs, and to keep Russia out.
But so do you think that the role of people in the media, and particularly in the news industry, which is what it's become now, has changed dramatically? I mean, you talked about Bosnia there, and you talked about how there you felt that you were making a difference. Is that something that you feel less nowadays?
I do feel less.
And before you start answering me, I'm just coming
Yeah.
to you all next, so please have your questions ready. We've got a couple of microphones that will be handed
I
around.
feel less, one, because of the politics obviously, that you know, came into play after Iraq, and that caused the opposite in Syria, so inaction, but much more death. But I also believe because it's all so diffuse and there isn't a shared moment anymore. And that's why maybe what's happening now, maybe the Trump administration, maybe even what might be happening in France if a far-right Le Pen gets in, or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, or all these sort of, you know, scenarios, I think maybe that will galvanize, you know, more people to just get more involved in civics, in actually going out and voting, and actually, you know, standing up for what we believe are hard-earned rights that are under threat right now. But I think for me, the most difficult part of sort of trying to coalesce is the fragmentation. It's weird because everybody thinks it's great. You know, things are on YouTube, things are here, things are there, but they're everywhere. And I think, and I'm not sure whether our filmmaker friends believe this or not, but I know that when you have a big television screen like that one or that one, and you have a whole group of people like in here watching one thing at the same time, there is a greater feeling of taking it in, understanding it, reacting to it, because we're all together and because it's affecting us all together, maybe even because we can talk about it afterwards, we can share. But it's not that way, even when you know, pass viral videos around. It's just not that way. You can pass it around and feel like you've done it.
Well, let's have some civic participation. Is there a brave person who will start things out? I'm afraid I've got a light shining right in my eye, so it's quite hard for me to see. But if you maybe wave an arm, or just put your hand up like you do in school. Come on, now that is, you see, that's the problem, isn't it?
Never mind,
really,
somebody
frankly.
will, somebody will.
We've got one here. We've got one here. We've got a live one here.
You got a live one.
Okay, thank you. If you could say your name, perhaps, and
Giacomo. Hi, I'm Giacomo. What would you suggest then is the solution to what you're talking about? How could we ameliorate this situation?
I do believe that, first of all, Syria is almost lost. When Russia entered, when Iran entered, and Aleppo fell, I'm not sure which way out of this now. That moment was before Russia came into the game. But that's the politics and the war aspect of it. In terms of what I'm talking about, you know, journalists, I'm really talking about journalists and not filmmakers now, just a different sort of aspect of this community. I think much more storytelling and much less talking head, for sure. I think that, again, as it was said before, storytelling, it's not just 100 years of film. Storytelling is what our whole millennia of civilization is based on. People told people what was going on in the world, you know, in their homes, in their towns, in their cities, in their world. And storytelling is what, you know, is the basis of our history. So I think storytelling in our business, the news business, is not as prevalent as it used to be and as it should be. And now, you know, there's a lot of documentaries, there's a lot of filmmaking. The daily storytelling report at a CNN or a BBC or whatever is less than it used to be. It's much more talking heads now, it's much more panels, it's much more of that kind of thing. And I understand because things develop that way, and it's actually a lot cheaper to do that. It's a lot more expensive to send real human beings into danger and to actually empower them to tell the stories and to stay as long as it takes to get the stories. So I think a lot more of that would help, at least corral maybe people back to the center of where they can actually see on a daily basis factual news storytelling.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Another question up here, perhaps? There's a lady in the second row from the back, in the middle, as difficult to get to as you could possibly be, I think, unfortunately. Great, thank you.
Hi, hello, I'm Jennifer. I'd just like to know what your description of fake news would be. It's a term that's bandied about a lot Trump seems to use it for anything he just doesn't like. It is a very real thing, but also just going back to what you said about the news being objective.
I'm really glad you asked that,
what
because I was
that
just
means.
about to say I want to talk about objectivity, because I know it's a word that gets flung around and nobody really believes it anymore. Everybody believes that, like filmmakers, many journalists come at it with a certain either ideological or propagandistic or values-based relationship to facts. So fake news are lies. We have grown up, our parents have told us that this is a lie and this is the truth. It's not that difficult. Fake news are deliberate lies that are put about for whatever reason, and it's not just accidental, as you know now, because too late, people actually started to go out and do the journalism about what's happening online, what's happening in Macedonia, who the young people are that are, producing fake news reports and getting a lot of money for it because of the click-tivism, because of the clickbait, because of the advertisers who actually pay for that stuff. So fake news is that. And so there's obviously a huge debate going on right now about how the public can recognize fake news. And that's very difficult, because nor do we want to get into censorship. So there are all sorts of different, suggestions about so-called the good housekeeping seal of what's a trustworthy, credible, outlet. The whole fact-checking business that we now have to, go into, the whole sort of way of trying to, narrow down Facebook, Twitter, all these posts, being really careful about what they put out there and not putting stuff that's they know is fake. I mean, the hilarious thing, was that some of these people have come out, and these are, people who actually make things up out of whole cloth. And one of them came out and said about, I can't remember which story it was. It wasn't Pizzagate. It wasn't, I can't remember what it was, but some completely outlandish story. Said, it's so easy for us. People are just ignorant. They just don't give a damn. They'll just read it. They won't even read the story. They'll read the headline and pass it on, and they'll believe it. So there was this crazy statistic that something like the fake news got more clicks than the top 20 credible, legitimate, long-serving news organizations in the world. And that's really shocking. So I think there are a lot of ways that people are trying to figure out now, how do you make that division between what's truthful and what's lies without going into the full censorship mode, which obviously would be unacceptable. One of the ways you could do it, I read a kind of an interesting suggestion, was that obviously platforms have to just not pay for advertising on those things. Advertisers have to boycott those places as well. And we have to be able to start telling people if Breitbart or other such, organizations are advertising on certain, certain products or whatever, tell those products that they're carrying those kinds of adverts. So there are all sorts of citizen ways of trying to figure out how to do it. Now, what's objectivity? Objectivity is not in the eye of the beholder. Objectivity is, again, truth, and it doesn't mean neutrality, and it doesn't mean a moral equivalence, and it certainly doesn't mean a factual equivalence. And I came across objectivity in Bosnia when I was a really young journalist, and I was faced with, stuff that it was just, life and death happening before my eyes against a backdrop of a Western civilization, Europeans, American governments, that simply didn't want to intervene to stop this wholesale slaughter of civilians and used the word, all sides are equally guilty, this is centuries of ethnic hatred, there is nothing we can do. None of that was true. It wasn't centuries of ethnic hatred. For many, many centuries and decades, certainly in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, people had lived together, intermarried, and all the rest of it. Sure, there had been moments of war between them, but that wasn't the recent history. And certainly all sides were not equally guilty. One side was 100 times more guilty than another side. One side had all the heavy weapons, all the sniping rifles, all that stuff arrayed in the mountains above Sarajevo, which was in a valley, and they were shooting and sniping children, women, old men, and all that kind of stuff. So I was telling the truth, like all my colleagues there, the BBC, American networks, all our newspapers, radio stations, everybody was there. And by the way, it was the last time, I'll come to that in a moment, but I remember people getting all bent out of shape and saying, Amanpour, she's siding with the Muslims. She's just telling one side of this story. And I remember getting really upset about it because objectivity is our golden rule as journalists. And I had to, in that moment, figure out what objectivity was. And I realized that objectivity, particularly in instances where you have gross violations of international law, violations of human rights, actual ethnic cleansing and genocide, I mean, the most serious violations under international law in the world, that you can't pretend to be neutral, and you can't pretend that neutrality is objectivity, because then you're an accomplice. And so I figured out that it was telling the truth, and the truth wasn't comfortable, and the truth often isn't comfortable, which is why even today, look at the climate debate. I mean, can you imagine that for all these decades, people have been trying to do on the one hand, on the other hand, about climate, where 99.9% of the science exists here, and nothing exists here, or 0.1%. I mean, it's nutty. It's nutty. It's just completely nutty.
We are encroaching on the English lunchtime.
That's perfect.
And that is a crime against humanity, I think you'll find.
It is.
So I'm
Especially if it goes with a pint of beer.
Exactly. So I'm going to ask you just one last question,
Yeah.
and it's one of those horrible ones where you probably won't remember the thing. But I just wondered if you might tell us, you spent your whole life immersed in imagery and creating imagery to create impact with viewers. If there is a moment, a piece of film, it doesn't have to be news, that really stands out for you as something that took your breath away, that arrested your thinking.
Well, again, I was reminded by one of the, I think it was in Hassan's film, and there was that whole bit at the beginning when they were saying, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And I remember very, very distinctly in the early years of the Bosnian War, waiting outside Srebrenica there was one sort of kind gesture by those who were besieging Srebrenica to allow civilians out, including children. And we were in the next town, and we waited at a hospital, and we saw, this covered truck coming towards the hospital. And they opened the tarpaulin, and out came this child with his head almost blown off. And it was really, really damaged and really wounded. And all I remember is the complete shock and the intake of breath from everybody, all the journalists who were there. We couldn't believe it. And I remember the doctor just kept saying to him in Serbo-Croat, ne bojim se, don't be afraid.
Well, thank you very much. Christiane Amanpour, bringing to a close